In 2009, Britain decided to take a step into the future. For $42 billion, the country decided to build the biggest infrastructure project in its history. A high-speed rail network that stretched over 300 miles and would rival the systems built in Japan and China. And it would do so while uniting the whole country. But what began as a symbol of national ambition has slowly spiraled into political chaos, exploding costs, public outrage, environmental battles, and years of bitter controversy. Today, HS2 is expected to cost more than $100 billion. The original vision is in ruins, and the project has become a national argument about whether modern Britain can still build anything at all. So how did it go so horribly wrong? This is the story of the $100 billion megaproject that broke Britain. Britain invented the railway. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway became the first inner-city passenger rail service in the world. British engineers exported the technology across Europe, across America, across the entire industrialized world. For a century, the railway was a British idea, and Britain's network was the envy of the planet. But in the 21st century, Britain's infrastructure was beginning to crack. Its trains were overcrowded, its rail lines were aging, and while countries across Europe and Asia raced into the future with high-speed rail, Britain was still relying on Victorian infrastructure. France's TGV had been running since 1981, Japan's Shinkansen since 1964, 45 years before HS2 was approved, connecting Tokyo to Osaka, 500 kilometers apart, in 2 hours and 15 minutes. Spain had quietly built one of the most extensive high-speed networks in Europe. China, in roughly 15 years, constructed more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. 38,000 kilometers of track by 2020. Britain had 113. The country that gave the world the railway was being lapped by everyone it had once taught. The problem wasn't just speed. The West Coast Main Line, connecting London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, cities with a combined population of over 24 million people, was handling 75 million passenger journeys a year by 2008. Freight trains and passenger expresses shared the same Victorian-era tracks, running at different speeds, queuing through bottlenecks that hadn't fundamentally changed in a century. Britain had already spent $11 billion modernizing the West Coast Main Line through the 2000s. A project that came in $7.6 billion over its original budget took a decade, caused enormous disruption, and still left the line prone to overcrowding. 2/3 of the additional capacity it created had already been absorbed by passenger growth within 7 years of completion. The line had hit a ceiling, and there was no way to raise it without building something entirely new. Then there was the divide. London, by the late 2000s, had become a different country from the rest of England. Crossrail was under construction beneath it. The underground was being upgraded. Billions in transport investment compounded year after year into a city running at a completely different speed from everywhere else. Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, cities generating a significant share of Britain's GDP, were still connected to the capital by a Victorian railway running at Victorian speeds. The economic consequences were visible. Businesses concentrated in London because London had the infrastructure. Graduates chose London because opportunity compounded there. The gap between the capital and everywhere else wasn't just economic, it was physical, baked into the railway map, and it was getting wider every year. In 2009, the government made a decision. Britain was going to build a new railway, a brand new high-speed line, the most ambitious infrastructure project the country had attempted since the Victorian era itself. The budget was stated at $42 billion. Cities in the North and Midlands that had watched investment flow south for decades allowed themselves something they hadn't felt about a government infrastructure announcement in a long time, something close to belief. The country that invented the railway was going to build one again. When the full plan was published, it was the most ambitious transport project Britain had attempted in over a century, a Y-shaped network stretching from London all the way to Manchester and Leeds, trains running at 225 miles per hour, faster than anything that had ever run on British soil. London to Birmingham in 49 minutes, London to Manchester in 68, Leeds in 88. Cities that had spent decades feeling like they were on the wrong side of a divide would suddenly be closer to the capital than many London commuters were to their own offices. Each train would carry 1,100 passengers. Two could be coupled together at peak times. 30 million people lived within reach of the proposed network. The West Coast Main Line, stripped of the intercity traffic HS2 would absorb, would have room for the regional services, the freight trains, and the local connections that had been squeezed out for years. The whole railway ecosystem would breathe again. The numbers attached to it were extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of jobs, in construction, in the cities the line would serve, in the businesses that would cluster around the new stations. Manchester alone was projected to see 30,000 station-supported jobs. Birmingham would get its first new intercity terminus in over 150 years, and around it, decades of post-industrial land sitting unused in the heart of one of Britain's biggest cities would be transformed. Leeds, Sheffield, the East Midlands, city leaders who had spent years lobbying for better connections to London were being told their turn had finally come. At Euston, the terminus that would anchor the entire network in London, the vision was a complete rebuild. A regenerated Euston was projected to create 34,000 jobs, deliver 2,500 new homes, and add $52 billion to the UK economy by 2053. Britain's most unloved major station, grey, cramped, an embarrassment for a country that was supposed to be a global capital, would become something people would travel to see, not just through. Fully built, HS2 would give Britain one of the 10 longest high-speed rail networks in the world. Not a regional line, not a commuter upgrade, a genuine national high-speed network, placing Britain alongside France, Japan, and Spain in a category it had been watching from the outside for 40 years. Cross-party support existed at Westminster in a way that was increasingly rare for anything. Business groups backed it, trade unions backed it, city leaders across the North and Midlands backed it. 3 consecutive governments, Labour, Coalition, Conservative, had all looked at HS2 and reached the same conclusion. Britain needed this. Britain was doing this. Construction on Phase 1 was approved. The machines would move in. The most significant piece of infrastructure Britain had committed to since the Victorian era was becoming real. And then came the question that had been sitting quietly underneath all of it. Could Britain actually pull this off? It wasn't an unreasonable thing to ask. Britain had a recent and uncomfortable track record with large infrastructure. The West Coast Main Line modernization, the upgrade that was supposed to fix the capacity problem before HS2 was conceived, had come in $7.6 billion over budget and years late. Wembley Stadium, finished in 2007, was delivered 2 years behind schedule and hundreds of millions over cost. The Edinburgh Trams project, approved at $600 million, eventually cost $1.5 billion and took years longer than promised. These weren't anomalies, they were a pattern, and HS2 was orders of magnitude larger than any of them. The budget, at parliamentary approval, was $54 billion, already revised upward from the $42 billion first stated 3 years earlier. The government said the increase reflected more detailed design work. A 2012 National Audit Office report said the cost estimates carried significant uncertainty and that the contingency reserves might not be sufficient. Independent analysts pointed out that no major UK infrastructure project in recent memory had come in on budget. Several noted that the further a project progressed through design, the more expensive it tended to become, not less. The government heard all of it and pressed ahead. In 2017, the construction contracts were signed. Thousands of workers began moving into position across the route. Ancient woodland in the Chilterns was cleared. Land was compulsorily purchased. The machinery of the largest infrastructure project in British history began to turn. Within months, the budget was already moving. When Britain approved HS2 in 2012, the assumption was that construction would begin within a few years. It didn't begin until 2020. 8 years passed between the political decision and the first machine moving, 8 years of parliamentary bills, legal challenges, design revisions, environmental impact assessments, and compulsory purchase negotiations. Each of these stages took much longer than expected, and each stage cost money, billions of it, before a single meter of track existed anywhere except on paper. By the time construction formally started, Britain had already spent billions simply getting to the starting line. The project that had been sold to the public as a $42 billion railway had already gone way above budget. That number was an estimate made at a point when nobody had yet grappled with the full complexity of what building it would actually require. And that grappling began almost immediately. In 2013, just a year after approval, the government revised the budget upward to $54 billion. That was the Megaproject's first encounter with the reality of routing a high-speed railway through 200 miles of English countryside, suburbs, and cities without destroying everything in the way. Every tunnel had to be surveyed. Every utility had to be mapped. Every community along the route had objections, and many of those objections had legal weight. Political pressure from communities in the Chilterns, a protected area of outstanding natural beauty, led to a decision to extend the tunnel beneath it rather than cutting through on the surface. That single change added hundreds of millions to the bill and set a precedent. If one community could move the line underground, others would ask for the same. By 2015, the budget had been reset again, this time to $71 billion, now set in 2015 prices. The National Audit Office noted that year that the schedule was already showing signs of strain. The project, they said, was under financial pressure and risked falling behind before it had properly started. Nobody in the government wanted to hear that. The political commitment was too large, the announcements too public, the expectations in the North and Midlands too high to allow any serious reconsideration. So the warnings were noted, filed, and the project moved forward. The first major contracts finally went out in 2017, $8.4 billion worth, split across several large construction firms. For the companies involved, this was generational work. For HS2, it was the moment the project stopped being a plan and became a physical operation. One of those companies was Carillion, Britain's second biggest contractor at the time. Carillion had government work running across schools, hospitals, army bases, and railways. Their share of the HS2 contracts was worth $1.6 billion. But just 3 weeks before the contracts were awarded, Carillion had issued a profit warning. The company was in serious financial trouble. And 6 months later, Carillion collapsed. There was $37 million left in the bank. Its liabilities were $8.7 billion, making it the largest trading liquidation in British history. Thousands of subcontractors found themselves unpaid overnight. The government scrambled to keep other Carillion public contracts running, and HS2 had lost a major contractor before it had built anything at all. The consortium was restructured, new partners brought in, but the collapse had exposed something that ran deeper than one failed company. The contracts themselves had been written without completed designs, meaning contractors had signed agreements before anyone fully understood what was being asked of them. As designs evolved, as tunnels grew longer, as ground conditions proved harder than surveys had suggested, contractors submitted variation claims for work outside their original scope. The contracts placed most of the risk on HS2 Limited rather than the people doing the building, meaning there was limited ability to push back. Every variation claim that was accepted added to the bill. Every disputed claim added months of delay. The costs kept climbing. The criticism kept growing. By 2019, HS2 Limited's own chairman, Alan Cook, had seen enough. He published an internal assessment that landed with the force of a confession. The real cost, he said, could reach $112 billion. Completion might not come until 2040. The figures that had been cited in Parliament for years bore no resemblance to what the project's own leadership privately believed. The government's response was to commission a review. Douglas Oakervee, a former HS2 chairman, was brought in to examine whether the project should continue. His conclusion was that it should, but his diagnosis was damning. Costs had, in his own words, got carried away. Too many chairmen, too many secretaries of state, too little continuity of oversight. The pricing had been kept in 2015 figures long after those figures had stopped reflecting reality, meaning Parliament and the public had been reading numbers that everyone inside the project knew were out of date. Boris Johnson accepted the recommendation to proceed. He stood in a field in Solihull in September 2020 and declared construction had officially begun. 12 years after the idea was first floated, the machines were moving. The budget he announced that day was reset to a range of $91 billion to $124 billion. That was more than double the figure Parliament had approved 8 years earlier, and it came with a familiar promise. Better governance was coming, tighter cost controls were in place, lessons had been learned. The National Audit Office had heard this before. They had been raising concerns since 2013. They had published warnings in 2016, in 2019, in 2020. Each time they found the same things: costs higher than stated, schedules slipping, oversight insufficient. Each time the government acknowledged the findings, issued reassurances, and changed very little. The Public Accounts Committee would eventually describe HS2 as a casebook example of how not to run a major project. Through all the troubles, with the machines finally moving, the official position was that the difficult part was over. It wasn't. What was clear in that moment of manufactured optimism was that the public had been watching all of this. 8 years of delays, budgets doubling, and hollow reassurances. The communities along the route were already organizing. And by the time Boris Johnson took his photograph in that field, the war against HS2 had already been running for years. By this point, HS2 had been a story of frustrating delays and broken promises, and it was about to get worse. Because while the arguments about budgets and reviews were playing out in Westminster, the route itself was cutting through real places: fields, villages, gardens, woods that had been standing for centuries. The compulsory purchase notices had been landing on doormats since 2017. Farmers received letters telling them land their families had worked for generations was needed for a construction compound. Homeowners in Buckinghamshire and Warwickshire found their properties effectively unsellable because a railway was coming and nobody wanted to buy next to it. Some waited years for compensation. Some are still waiting. 108 ancient woodlands stood in the path of Phase 1 alone. The Woodland Trust called it the biggest assault on ancient woodland in a generation. Trees that had been growing since the medieval era were coming down for a project that was already years behind schedule and billions over budget. The Stop HS2 campaign had been running since 2010. For years, it was the respectable face of opposition. Voters in the Chilterns and Buckinghamshire felt their communities were being demolished for a railway that served London and passed through everywhere else without stopping. When the machines finally arrived, it stopped being respectable. Protection camps appeared along the route. Activists moved into threatened woodlands, built tree houses, and even chained themselves to trees. The longest-running camp was at Harville Road in the Colne Valley that lasted 3.5 years before bailiffs finally cleared it. By early 2021, the government had spent close to $64 million just dealing with activist protests along the route. Confrontation that caught the country's attention happened at Euston. In September 2020, a group of activists set up a protection camp in Euston Square Gardens, a small green space near the station that HS2 planned to concrete over for a construction compound. Over the following weeks, working at night, the protesters dug a network of tunnels beneath it. The tunnels were codenamed Kelvin and Crystal, and one was claimed to be 100 feet long. When the bailiffs arrived, the activists locked themselves inside. Some chained their arms into metal tubes set in concrete underground. One of the activists was 18 years old. After not being able to get anywhere, bailiffs drilled from above. The tunnels started flooding in bad weather. A high court judge rejected the activists' legal challenge and ordered them to leave. One by one, they were removed, and the last one came out after a month underground. This occupation lasted 31 days. The longest tunnel protest in Britain in 2 decades. It couldn't stop anything. The trees came down. The compound was built. However, the images of a teenager locked into a flooded tunnel under central London to protest a railway had traveled around the world. the anger wasn't confined to activists either. In June 2021, a by-election was held in Chesham and Amersham, a safe Conservative seat in Buckinghamshire that the party had held since its formation in 1974. HS2 ran directly through the constituency and the most dominant issues of the campaign. The Conservatives lost the seat on a swing of 25 percentage points, one of the largest by-election swings in modern British political history. A railway project had just cost the government a seat it had held for half a century. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because the people protesting in the tunnels at Euston and the voters switching in Chesham and Amersham weren't angry about the same thing. The Buckinghamshire homeowners thought HS2 cost too much and destroyed too much for too little benefit. The environmental activists thought it was a vanity project that prioritized speed over the planet. The cities of the north thought it didn't go far enough and was already being quietly undermined. And a growing number of transport economists were arguing that the money would have done more good modernizing the existing network than building a new one. Nobody could agree on what HS2 should even be anymore, and the government, watching its budget spiral and its political capital drain, was about to make a decision that would unite all of them in fury. The war against HS2 had made noise. It had cost the government a safe parliamentary seat. It had put the project on the front pages for years. But the tunneling machines were still boring through the Chilterns. The viaduct foundations were still rising out of fields. Construction was slow and expensive and chaotic, but it was moving. What ultimately brought HS2 down wasn't the protesters, it was the arithmetic. By 2021, the budget had already more than doubled from the figure Parliament had approved 9 years earlier. The Oakervie Review had said explicitly that the project only made financial sense if the full Y-shaped network was built, that a London to Birmingham line alone couldn't justify what it cost. The government had accepted that finding, and then in November 2021, quietly buried inside a document about integrated rail planning, it cancelled the eastern leg to Leeds anyway. The cities of Yorkshire and the East Midlands had been promised high-speed rail for a decade. Sheffield, Nottingham, Derby, Leeds, all of them had built economic strategies around it, attracted investment on the basis of it, told businesses and residents it was coming. What they got instead was a promise of upgrades to the existing Victorian Railway, the same network HS2 had been conceived to replace. The business case for what remained had just gotten significantly harder to justify. The project was now more expensive and less useful than it had been the week before, but it continued. Then Euston started unraveling. The terminus that was supposed to bring HS2 into the heart of London had been budgeted at $3.3 billion in 2020. By early 2023, that figure had nearly doubled to $6.1 billion, driven by serious design problems and rising inflation. In March 2023, all work at Euston was paused. The hoardings stayed up, the cranes stopped, and a question that would have seemed unthinkable when the project was announced started being asked seriously: whether HS2 would ever actually reach central London, and if it couldn't, then why spend more than £100 billion on it? That was the state of the project when October 2023 arrived. At the Conservative Party conference, held that year in Manchester, the city whose connection was about to be cancelled, the Prime Minister announced that everything north of Birmingham was gone. The Manchester leg, the Birmingham to Crewe section, all of it. In their place, $46 billion would be redirected into hundreds of smaller transport projects across the country. The North's reaction was not complicated. Why support a project that essentially left them behind? Every time HS2 was cut, the cost per passenger served went up. A shorter railway serving fewer cities cost nearly as much to build but delivers a fraction of the benefit. The smaller it became, the harder it was to justify the money already spent. The harder it was to justify, the more pressure there was to cut further. Each decision made the next one more likely, and nobody designing the project in 2009 had built in any mechanism to break that cycle. What was left after Manchester was a single phase, London to Birmingham. The Department for Transport and HS2 Limited couldn't even agree on what it would cost. The department's estimate ran to $69 billion in 2019 prices. HS2 Limited's own figure reached $84 billion. Then, on May 19, 2026, the Transport Secretary stood up in the House of Commons and delivered the latest reckoning. The new estimated cost for completing Phase 1 was between $111 billion and $130 billion in 2025 prices. The opening date had moved to somewhere between 2036 and 2039. The maximum speed was being cut from 224 miles per hour to 199 to save money. A railway built around speed, justified partly on the basis of speed, was being slowed down because it had become too expensive to run. The government had previously commissioned an internal review into whether scrapping the project entirely would be better value than finishing it. They decided to continue, not because the case was strong, but because so much had already been spent that stopping now would cost tens of billions and deliver nothing at all. Euston remains unresolved. Private investment is now being sought for a station with no confirmed budget, no confirmed timeline, and no confirmed investor. Services between Old Oak Common and Birmingham are now expected to begin between 2036 and 2039. The full connection between Euston and Birmingham, the original promise, is not expected before 2040 at the earliest, and possibly 2043. A railway approved in 2012 with an opening date of 2026, now opening, at best, in 2036, at worst, beyond 2040, at a cost 3 times what Parliament voted for, serving 2 cities instead of 8, running slower than designed, its central London terminus still uncertain, its northern legs gone. For critics, the country that invented the railway is spending $130 billion building a stub. So, what is HS2 then? A monumental effort to bring the future, or a colossal failure? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the middle. To get a more balanced view, we need to look at what was actually built. The Colne Valley Viaduct stretches for 2.1 miles across a series of lakes and waterways west of London. It is Britain's longest railway bridge, and by any measure, a genuine feat of engineering. By the end of 2024, HS2 Limited and its contractors had begun construction on 42 viaducts, 103 bridges, 59 cuttings, and 75 embankments across the project. 12 tunneling machines have been boring through the earth beneath the Chilterns and northwest London. By the end of February 2026, more than $59 billion had been spent on the program. Tens of thousands of workers are still on site. 70% of the earthworks program has been delivered and nearly 300,000 tons of steel has been used. When it eventually opens, HS2 will work. It will carry passengers faster than anything Britain has run before. It will relieve pressure on the West Coast Main Line, and the cities it connects will be genuinely better served than they are today. The physical scale of what has been built is extraordinary, and it is rarely acknowledged in a conversation that has been dominated, understandably, by the things that went wrong. And there's a lot that did go wrong. A major review published alongside the May 2026 announcement found that gold-plating HS2, including the obsessive focus on achieving the highest possible speeds, was among the core faults that drove cost to where they are. A railway designed to run at 225 miles per hour requires infrastructure built to tolerances that cost exponentially more than a railway running at 200. The difference in journey time between those two speeds, over 200 kilometers, is minutes. The difference in construction cost was billions. Britain also built HS2 in the most expensive possible way. The fragmented planning system meant years of legal challenges before a machine moved. The decision to start construction before designs were complete handed contractors, a blank check for variations. The contracts placed risk on the public rather than the private sector. The stop-start political funding, every change of government bringing fresh reviews, fresh uncertainty, fresh redesigns, meant contractors priced uncertainty into every bid. 2/3 of the cost increases were attributed to delivery failures and poor management, 1/3 to inflation. Most of the money wasn't lost to bad luck. It was lost to a system that seemed almost designed to produce the outcome it produced. Compare that to how other countries build railways. Spain has the second longest high-speed rail network in the world, built at a cost per kilometer that makes British infrastructure economists deeply uncomfortable. The French TGV network was built through a planning system that gave the state authority to move quickly and decisively. Japan's Shinkansen extensions are delivered on time and on budget with a consistency that seems almost incomprehensible from a British perspective. China builds entire high-speed lines in the time it took HS2 to get through its parliamentary process. None of those countries have perfect infrastructure records, but all of them have built systems that work, that carry passengers, that transformed the economic geography of their nations. Britain spent 15 years and $130 billion and produced a construction site. So instead of a national network that connected 8 cities and brought the North and Midlands within easy reach of London, created an even bigger divide. A railway that could rebalance a country left an even greater chasm, and the question marks will linger on for decades. The story goes deeper than HS2 specifically and becomes a commentary on Britain more broadly. The country has delivered large infrastructure before. The Channel Tunnel opened in 1994, over budget and behind schedule, but it opened and it works. Crossrail, the Elizabeth Line, was delivered years late and billions over its original estimate, but it now carries hundreds of thousands of passengers a day through the center of London and has transformed travel across the city. The 2012 Olympics came in on budget and was widely regarded as a success. HS1, the high-speed line from the Channel Tunnel to London, was built and has operated reliably for 2 decades. So the capacity exists. What HS2 had that those projects didn't was a combination of factors that proved fatal in combination. A scope that kept changing under political pressure. A delivery organization that was rebuilt multiple times without ever developing the institutional continuity that large projects require. A contract structure that rewarded delay. A political culture in which no minister wanted to deliver bad news, so bad news accumulated until it became catastrophic news. The head of the National Audit Office described HS2 as a megaproject, arguably too large for the risks to be manageable by the relevant departments. That observation cuts to the heart of it. It doesn't point to a single villain or a single bad decision that, if corrected, would have produced a different outcome. It points to something systemic, a gap between Britain's ambitions for its infrastructure and its ability to deliver them that HS2 exposed but did not create. The project that was supposed to prove modern Britain could build something worthy of a modern nation ended up exposing the cracks in the wider political system. Cracks that would take years, even decades, to put concrete over. What do you think of Britain's push to build a high-speed rail to rival the developed nations? Was it all worth it? And would this ever be built? Or is this going the same route as California's collapsing bid to build America's first high-speed rail? Speaking of which, check out our video on America's megaprojects that wasted billions. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like. And keep following Signum for more stories from the world's biggest megaprojects.